balcony of the Lorraine Motel faces west, and in the late afternoon, the sun turns the brick walls the color of old honey. Before we go any further into this story, if you want a brand new American mystery every single night, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. It is April in Memphis. The air smells like rain that has not fallen yet. The magnolia trees along the street are just beginning to open, their white petals soft as folded cloth. A man stands on that balcony. He is 39 years old. He is tired in the way that only certain people get tired, the kind that lives behind the eyes and never quite goes away. His name is Martin Luther King Jr., and in a few minutes, he will be gone. That moment has been studied and argued over for more than 50 years now. Books have been written, trials have been held, files have been opened and then quietly closed again. And still, something about it does not sit right. Something about the whole picture feels like a puzzle, where one piece was cut to fit by someone who wanted you to stop asking questions. This is not a story about what the history books agreed on. This is the story that lived in the margins, the one passed down in whispered conversations and late-night reading, the one that asks a simple question. What if the man who pulled the trigger was not the only man responsible? What if the people who wanted Martin Luther King silenced were not strangers in the dark, but men in offices, men with budgets, men with reasons? Stay with that thought for a moment. Let it settle like dust after a long walk. Martin Luther King was not just a preacher with a dream. By 1968, he had become something that made powerful people deeply uncomfortable. He had moved past the question of race. He was talking about money now, about war, about the way the whole system was built and who it was built to serve. He was planning to bring thousands of poor people, black, white, brown, red, to Washington, D.C., and simply refused to leave until something changed. That kind of talk had a different weight to it. That kind of talk cost people money. There were men who had watched him for years, men who had tapped his phones and read his letters and sent agents to follow him from city to city. Men who wrote memos about him using words that were cold and clinical and full of a hatred they dressed up as duty. These men did not like what Martin Luther King was becoming. And they had tools at their disposal that most people never knew existed. The story of what happened in Memphis is also the story of those men. It is the story of a government program designed to destroy people without ever touching them. It is the story of a trial held 30 years after the fact in a small courtroom in Tennessee, where a jury heard evidence and came back with a verdict that almost nobody reported. It is the story of a family that never believed the official answer and spent decades trying to prove it. And underneath all of it, quiet as a river running under ice, is the story of a man who saw something coming and walked toward it anyway. There is a photograph taken the morning of April 4th, 1968. Martin Luther King is standing in the parking lot of the Lorraine Motel. He is laughing. His head is thrown back, and his eyes are bright, and he looks, in that one frozen moment, like a man without a care in the world. People who knew him said he was in good spirits that day. He had preached the night before at a church in Memphis, and the sermon had moved people to tears. He was looking forward to dinner. Someone was making catfish. By 6 o'clock that evening, he was dead. A single shot. A rented room across the street. A man named James Earl Ray, who would confess and then recant, and then spend the rest of his life in prison saying the story was not what it seemed. Maybe he was lying. People in prison often are. Or maybe he was telling the truth, and the truth was so large and so tangled and so dangerous to certain people that it was easier to let one man carry the whole weight of it alone. That is the question this story asks. And it is a question that, even now, does not have a clean answer. Memphis sits on a bluff above the Mississippi River. The river there is wide and brown and slow, the color of old copper. In the spring, the air smells like mud and honeysuckle, and something else underneath, something green and alive that rises up from the water and settles over the whole city like a warm hand. April in Memphis is not quite summer yet. The trees are full and heavy with new leaves. The dogwoods bloom white and pink along the sidewalks. The days are long and golden. The nights are soft. You can sit on a porch in April in Memphis and feel the whole world breathing around you. In 1968, Memphis was a city of about 500,000 people. It sat right at the edge of the Deep South, close enough to feel it in the bones of the place. The streets downtown were lined with brick buildings, some of them 4 and 5 stories tall, their facades dark with age and river soot. Neon signs hung above the storefronts. Barber poles turned slowly in the afternoon light. Men in short-sleeved shirts and narrow ties walked the sidewalks. Women wore dresses that fell below the knee. The cars were long and wide and chrome bright, their fins catching the sun like the tails of slow fish. The radio was everywhere. It came from open windows and passing cars, and the little transistor sets that men carried in their shirt pockets. The music was changing. Memphis had always been a music city. The blues had lived here for decades, born in the Delta, and carried north along the river. But in 1968, something new was mixing in. Soul music, rhythm and blues, the sound of people who had been quiet for a long time and were not quiet anymore. The city was also deeply divided. That is the plain truth of it. Memphis had 2 worlds inside it, pressed up against each other, separated by invisible lines that everyone knew and almost no one talked about openly. White Memphis and Black Memphis, different schools, different neighborhoods, different water fountains, not so many years before. The Civil Rights Act had passed in 1964. The Voting Rights Act in 1965. The laws had changed, but laws are words on paper. The city itself changed more slowly. South Main Street ran through a part of Memphis that had seen better days. The buildings there were older, a little tired. Rooming houses and small diners and pawnshops with their windows full of guitars and watches. The Lorraine Motel sat on Mulberry Street, just off South Main. It was a 2-story building, painted white and turquoise, the colors bright against the older brick around it. A long balcony ran the length of the 2nd floor. The parking lot in front was open to the street. It was not a grand place. It was comfortable and clean and welcoming, and it was one of the few motels in Memphis where Black travelers could stay without trouble. That mattered. In 1968, it still mattered. Across Mulberry Street, the neighborhood was a mix of old rooming houses and weedy lots and low buildings with peeling paint. One of those buildings was Bessie Brewer's rooming house at 422.5 South Main. It was a worn-out place. The hallways smelled like old wood and cooking grease. The rooms were small and dim. A bathroom at the end of the hall had a window that looked out over the back of the building. Across a brushy slope, straight toward the Lorraine Motel's second-floor balcony. The distance between that bathroom window and the balcony of room 306 was about 200 feet. You could cover it with a decent rifle in less than a second. The spring of 1968 was not a peaceful time in America. The country felt like a rope pulled tight from both ends. The Vietnam War was grinding on, and the news from overseas was grim. Protests filled the streets of cities from coast to coast. Just 2 months before, in February, the Tet Offensive had shocked the nation. People who had believed the government's promises about the war were beginning to doubt. The doubt was spreading like water through cracked ground. And in Memphis, in the first days of April, 1,300 sanitation workers were on strike. They were almost all black men. They carried signs that said 3 simple words: "I am a man." They had been walking those picket lines since February in the cold and the rain, asking for something basic: dignity, a living wage, the right to be treated like human beings who mattered. That is the world Martin Luther King walked into when he came to Memphis. A city in bloom, a country in pain, and a parking lot bathed in the warm gold light of a spring afternoon. Those 1,300 men had names. That matters, because when we talk about big events in history, the names at the center get all the attention. The leaders, the speakers, the men whose faces end up on posters. But every great story starts somewhere smaller. It starts with ordinary people who got tired of being treated like they were worth nothing. So let's start there. Let's start with the men who carried the garbage. Their names were Eckhall Cole and Robert Walker. They were sanitation workers in Memphis. They worked long days in the heat and the cold, hauling trash through the neighborhoods of a city that barely acknowledged they existed. They were paid almost nothing. They had no benefits. If it rained, they didn't work. And if they didn't work, they didn't get paid. They were not allowed to eat lunch inside the buildings where they collected trash. They ate outside, or they didn't eat at all. On February 1st, 1968, it was raining hard. Cole and Walker climbed inside the back of their garbage truck to get out of the rain. The truck's compactor was old and poorly maintained. It activated without warning. Both men were crushed to death inside the machine. They were 36 years old and 29 years old. They left behind families. They left behind children. And the city of Memphis offered their widows 1 month's pay and nothing more. That was the moment something broke open. Within days, 1,300 sanitation workers walked off the job. They were led by a man named T.O. Jones, a quiet, stubborn organizer who had been trying to build a union in Memphis for years. Jones was not a famous man. He was not a polished speaker. He was a man who showed up day after day and did the slow, hard work of convincing other men that they deserved better. He had thick hands and a steady voice, and he believed with his whole body that what they were doing was right. The workers marched through downtown Memphis in their work clothes. Some of them wore their gray uniforms. Some wore their Sunday best. They all carried the same sign, white letters on black cardboard. 4 words that said everything. I am a man. Think about what it takes to carry a sign like that. To have to announce your own humanity to the people around you. To have to ask out loud to be treated like a person. Those men walked through the cold February streets of Memphis, day after day, and they held those signs up like they were holding up the sky. The mayor of Memphis was a man named Henry Loeb. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a square jaw, and the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no. He had grown up wealthy. He had gone to good schools. He looked at the striking workers, and he saw a problem to be managed, not people to be heard. He refused to negotiate. He called the strike illegal. He sent police to follow the marchers, and he made it clear that he intended to wait them out. The city's black community rallied around the workers. Ministers opened their churches for strike meetings. Local women organized food drives to feed the strikers' families. The meetings were loud and full of singing, and the singing was the kind that fills a room from the floor up, the kind that makes the walls feel warm. And then the national press started paying attention. The story of Earl Cole and Robert Walker, two men crushed to death in a garbage truck, began to travel. It moved through newspapers and radio broadcasts and word of mouth. It reached the ears of civil rights leaders across the country. It reached the ears of a 39-year-old preacher from Atlanta who had been watching Memphis from a distance. Martin Luther King Jr. had been to Memphis before. He knew the city. He knew its wide, flat streets and its river smell, and the way the light fell golden and heavy in the late afternoon. He knew that Memphis was a city of deep divisions, where the color line was drawn hard and enforced without apology. He also knew that what was happening in Memphis was not just about garbage. It was about whether the poorest working people in America had the right to be seen, whether their labor had value, whether their lives had weight. Those were questions King had been asking for 15 years. They were the same questions that had followed him from Montgomery to Birmingham to Selma. And now, in the spring of 1968, all the way to the banks of the Mississippi River, he came to Memphis because the garbage men asked him to. He came because he believed their fight was his fight too. Martin Luther King Jr. did not start out as a problem. He started out as a preacher, a young man in a good suit who stood behind a pulpit and spoke about God and justice and the long, slow work of making America live up to its own promises. He was 26 years old when Montgomery, Alabama, handed him his first real test. He was 26 years old when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a city bus, and the Black community of Montgomery decided they would walk rather than ride under those conditions. They asked the young preacher to lead them. He said yes. That was 1955. It seems like a long time ago now. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days. Think about that for a moment. 381 mornings of walking to work in the Alabama heat. 381 evenings of walking home again, feet tired, backs straight, refusing to bend. King organized it. He spoke at the meetings. He kept people steady when they wanted to give up. And when it was over, when the Supreme Court said the bus segregation laws were unconstitutional, King was no longer just a preacher. He was something else, something that made certain people very uncomfortable. But even then, he was not yet a problem, not the kind that keeps powerful men up at night. He built the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He traveled. He preached. He organized sit-ins and marches and voter registration drives across the South. He went to jail more than once. He wrote letters from those jail cells that people still read today. His words were clean and plain, and they cut right through the noise. He had a way of saying things that made you feel like you had always known them, like he was just reminding you of something you had forgotten. The newspapers wrote about him. Television cameras followed him. He shook hands with presidents. He stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in the summer of 1963 and spoke to 250,000 people about a dream. His voice rolled out over that crowd like warm water, steady and deep, and the whole country heard it. That was the version of Martin Luther King that most of America thought it understood. The preacher with the dream, the man in the good suit, the voice on the television. But there was another version forming underneath that one. Quieter, more dangerous to the people who held power. King had always believed that racial justice and economic justice were the same fight. You could not separate them. What good was the right to sit at a lunch counter if you could not afford the meal? What good was the right to vote if the men you voted for answered only to the men with money? He had been saying this for years, in sermons and speeches and interviews. But in the mid-1960s, he started saying it louder. He looked at the cities of the North, Chicago, Detroit, Newark. He saw black neighborhoods packed tight with people who had come up from the South looking for something better and found a different kind of hard life waiting for them. Cramped apartments, underfunded schools, police who treated them like strangers in their own country. He moved to Chicago for a time. He walked those streets. He knocked on those doors. He sat in those apartments and listened. What he heard changed him. The poverty he found in the urban north was not an accident. It was a system. It had been built carefully over many decades by policies and banks and real estate rules and city governments that all worked together to keep certain people poor and keep them there. King began to say this plainly. He began to name the system out loud. And that was when he started to become a problem. Not to ordinary people. Ordinary people, black and white and every other kind, heard him and felt something loosen in their chests. They felt seen. They felt like someone was finally saying the true thing. But to the men who ran the system, the men who sat in boardrooms and government offices and military headquarters, King was no longer just a civil rights leader asking for fairness. He was a man who understood how power worked. He was a man who could explain it to millions of people in plain, simple language. He was a man who was starting to build something much bigger than a movement for racial equality. He was building a movement for the poor. All the poor, every color, every region. And that was a different kind of threat entirely. There was a night in April of 1967, a full year before Memphis, a full year before the balcony and the shot and the silence that followed. King stood at a podium inside Riverside Church in New York City. The building was enormous. Stone walls rose up around him like the inside of a mountain. The ceiling arched high overhead, pale and vaulted, catching the light of 1,000 candles. The pews were packed. People stood along the walls. Outside, the city hummed and rattled the way New York always does, indifferent to everything. He had notes in front of him. He had been working on this speech for months. Some of his closest advisors had begged him not to give it. They told him it was too much. They told him it would cost him allies he could not afford to lose. They told him to stay in his lane, to keep the focus on voting rights and fair housing and the long unfinished work of racial equality. He gave the speech anyway. It was called Beyond Vietnam, a time to break silence. He stood at that stone pulpit and he said what he believed. He said the United States government was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. He said the war in Vietnam was wrong. He said poor young men, black and white, were being sent to die in the jungles of Southeast Asia for a cause that had nothing to do with freedom. He said the money being spent on bombs and napalm and helicopter gunships was money stolen from schools and hospitals and housing, and the children who needed all of those things. He said it clearly. He said it slowly. He said it the way a man speaks when he has made his peace with the consequences. The room was very still. Outside, somewhere in that crowd, there were men with notebooks. Men whose job it was to write down what he said and report it back to offices in Washington. This was not new. They had been following him for years, but something about that night felt different. Something shifted in the air the way the air shifts just before a storm, when the light goes a little green and the birds go quiet. The speech went out over the radio. It went into living rooms and kitchens and barbershops and church halls across the country, and the reaction came fast. The newspapers turned on him, not the small ones, the big ones, the ones that shaped what millions of people thought. The Washington Post said he had done a disservice to the cause of peace and to the cause of civil rights. Time magazine called the speech a demagogic slander. The New York Times said he had weakened his moral authority by linking the war to the struggle at home. These were not fringe voices. These were the papers that presidents read with their morning coffee. And somewhere in Washington, in a building without windows on the upper floors, a man named J. Edgar Hoover read the coverage and felt something that might have been satisfaction. He had been saying for years that King was dangerous. He had been saying it in memos and in private meetings and in whispered conversations with senators and generals. Now, the newspapers were starting to say something like it too. Not in the same words, but close enough. King felt the change. People who knew him said he seemed quieter after that spring. Not broken, not afraid, but quieter, like a man who has said the true thing and is now waiting to see what the true thing costs him. He kept going. He always kept going. That was the thing about him that no amount of pressure ever seemed to touch. He kept writing and speaking and organizing and traveling. He kept building the Poor People's Campaign, the plan to bring thousands of struggling Americans to Washington and refuse to leave until something changed. The circle around him was tighter now. The surveillance was heavier. The phones clicked in ways they hadn't clicked before. Letters arrived opened and resealed. Strangers appeared at the edges of meetings. People nobody recognized. People who asked too many questions and wrote things down. Small things, easy to explain away one at a time. A coincidence here, a misunderstanding there, the ordinary friction of a busy life. But when you lay them all out together, when you look at the whole picture from a little distance, they stop looking like coincidences. They start looking like something else, something patient, something organized, something that had been watching for a long time and had finally decided it had seen enough. The people who knew him best noticed it first. Not the reporters, not the politicians, not the men in Washington who read the briefings and filed the memos. The people who noticed were the ones who sat in the pews on Sunday mornings, the ones who passed him coffee in church basements, the ones who had been marching beside him for years and knew the rhythm of his voice, the way you know the rhythm of a song you've heard your whole life. They noticed when the song changed. It wasn't sudden. It never is with things that matter. It was gradual, like the way the light shifts in late afternoon. One moment the sun is high and bright, and everything is clear. Then you look up, and the shadows have grown long without you ever seeing them move. He had always talked about race, about dignity, about the right of a black man and a black woman to walk through this country without fear. That message had cost him plenty already. Bombings, jail cells, death threats that came in the mail like ordinary letters. He had carried all of that and kept walking. But now he was talking about something bigger. He was talking about the poor, all of them. Black families in Alabama, white families in Appalachia, brown families in the fields of California, native families on land that had been taken from them before anyone alive could remember. He was talking about the machine that kept them all poor, the money that flowed from their labor into other hands, the wars that sent their sons to die in jungles, while the men who started those wars sent their own sons to college. That was the part that made people lean in close when they talked about him. An old deacon in a church in Atlanta put it this way. He said, when Martin was just talking about race, the powerful men were angry. But they were a certain kind of angry, the kind you can manage, the kind you can redirect. But when he started talking about money and war, and who really holds the strings in this country, that was a different kind of angry. That was the kind that doesn't cool down. People talked about it on church steps after service. They talked about it in barbershops where the radio played low and the conversation ran long. They talked about it at kitchen tables with the windows cracked open to let in the spring air. There was a woman in Memphis, a school teacher who had followed his work for years. She said she could feel the change in the room when he spoke now. She said the energy was different, heavier, like the air before a storm rolls in off the river. People were stirred up in a way that went past race, past region, past the old familiar lines that divided American life. He was pointing at something that touched everybody. And that, she said, was what scared certain people most of all. Because a movement built around one group of people can be contained. It can be isolated. You can build walls around it. You can tell the rest of the country that is their problem, not yours. But a movement that crosses every line, that brings together the sharecropper and the coal miner and the migrant worker and the veteran sleeping under a bridge. That is something else entirely. That is something that cannot be so easily boxed in. The old-timers had seen this before, not with him, but with others. Men who started pulling at threads that connected to bigger things and found themselves suddenly very alone, very watched, very vulnerable in ways they hadn't been before. There was a saying some of them passed around, quiet and careful, the way you pass around something fragile. They said, there are two kinds of trouble in this country. The kind that comes from being on the wrong side of the law, and the kind that comes from being on the right side of history too soon. The second kind, they said, is the one that really costs you. He knew this. You could see it in his eyes in the photographs from that period. The photographs from 1967 and early 1968. There is something in his face that wasn't there before. Not fear, something older than fear, something that looks like a man who has done the math and decided the answer doesn't change what he has to do. people who loved him saw it, and they held on to him a little tighter, and they kept showing up, because that was what you did. That was all you could do. You showed up, and you stood beside the man who was telling the truth, and you hoped that the truth was enough to hold the darkness back. The truth he was telling had a long history behind it, longer than most people knew, longer than the civil rights movement, longer than the Jim Crow laws, longer even than the country itself. To understand why the men in suits were so afraid of him, you have to go back, not just a few years, not just a few decades. You have to go back to the very bones of this nation and look at what was buried there. This land was built on two things: labor and war. Those two things were always connected, even when people pretended they weren't. The labor came first. It came from the backs of people who were not paid. It came from the hands of people who were not free. It built the ports and the roads and the great houses and the fields that stretched out like green oceans under the southern sun. The wealth that grew from that labor did not disappear when the war ended and the chains came off. It moved. It changed shape. It put on a suit and went to Washington. And the war never really stopped either. It just changed its name. After the Civil War, after Reconstruction, after the long, brutal years of Jim Crow, there was a new kind of war. A quiet one, a profitable one, the kind where the men who started it never had to pick up a rifle. They just had to sign contracts. They just had to make phone calls from offices with tall windows and good views. By the time Martin Luther King was born in 1929 in Atlanta, in a house on Auburn Avenue with a wide front porch, and the smell of his mother's cooking in every room, the war machine was already old. It had been running for generations. It had fed on every conflict this country ever entered. It had grown fat on the blood of young men, most of them poor, most of them with no other options. King grew up knowing this, not all at once. The way you learn most important things, slowly, piece by piece, like putting together a puzzle in a dim room. He was a preacher's son. He understood that the sacred and the political were never really separate. His grandfather had preached from that same church on Auburn Avenue. His father preached there too. church was a place where people came to be reminded that their lives had worth, that the suffering they carried was seen, that something larger than the men who oppressed them was watching over them. But King also read. He read deeply and widely. He read the economists and the philosophers. He read about Gandhi and about the long history of nonviolent resistance. He read about the way empires work, the way they need enemies to survive, the way they need wars to justify the spending, the way they need poor people to fight those wars and come home and be grateful for the chance. By the time he stood on that podium at Riverside Church in April of 1967 and named Vietnam out loud, he had been building to that moment for years. He had been watching the numbers. He had been watching which young men were dying in the jungle. He had been watching which neighborhoods they came from. He had been watching which companies were getting the contracts. He had been watching the money flow like a dark river from the poorest parts of America straight into the pockets of the wealthiest. And he named it. He said it plainly. He said the government of the United States was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. He said the war was stealing money that should have gone to schools and hospitals and housing. He said the poor were being sent to die for a country that would not treat them as full human beings when they came home. This was not a new idea. People had said versions of it before, but nobody with his reach had said it. Nobody with his voice. Nobody who could fill a church, fill a stadium, fill the streets of a city with people who believed him. The men who ran the war machine had tolerated him when he was talking about lunch counters and voting rights. Those things were uncomfortable but manageable. You could make adjustments. You could pass a law and call it progress and keep the deeper structure intact. But this was different. This went to the root. This named the system itself, not just the symptoms. The system. And the system had been running a very long time. It had survived a lot. It had outlasted a lot of people who tried to change it. It was not going to give up without a fight. So Martin Luther King started planning something new, something bigger than a march, bigger than a speech, something that would be very hard for the system to ignore. He called it the Poor People's Campaign. The idea was simple in the way that only the most powerful ideas are simple. He wanted to bring poor people to Washington, not just black people. All poor people, white people from Appalachia who had never had enough, Latino farm workers from California whose hands bled from the harvest, Native Americans whose land had been taken and whose children went hungry on reservations that the rest of the country had forgotten. Poor people of every color from every corner of the country coming together in one place at one time to say the same thing out loud. We are here. We are suffering. And you are going to have to look at us. The plan was to build a tent city on the National Mall, right there in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. They would call it Resurrection City. Thousands of people would live there in the mud and the rain until Congress passed a bill that addressed poverty directly, not symbolically, not with speeches and promises, with money and housing and jobs and food. King wanted to make poverty impossible to look away from. He wanted to put it right in front of the people who made the decisions. He wanted them to have to walk past it every single morning. Now, you have to understand what this looked like to certain people in Washington. A march for voting rights was one thing. You could frame that as a civil rights issue. You could contain it in a certain political box. But a multiracial coalition of the poor demanding economic justice was something else entirely. That was not a civil rights issue anymore. That was a class issue. That was a challenge to the way money moved in America. That was a challenge to who owned what, and who owed what, and who got to decide. That was a much bigger box, and it did not have a lid. King had been talking to organizers for months. He had been traveling, speaking, recruiting. He went to poor communities that nobody in Washington was paying attention to. He sat in living rooms in rural Mississippi. He met with labor leaders in Chicago. He talked to young men in cities who had nothing and knew it, and were starting to get angry about it in ways that scared everyone. He was building something. You could feel it the way you can feel a storm building on a flat horizon. The air changes. The light changes. Something is coming, and you cannot stop it. You can only decide whether to be inside or outside when it arrives. The men who kept files on him could feel it too. His phone was already tapped, had been for years. The FBI had agents who attended his speeches and wrote reports. They had informants inside his inner circle, people who passed along details about his plans and his movements and his private conversations. They had been watching him for a long time, but now the watching had a different quality to it, more urgent, more focused. The reports got longer. The surveillance got tighter, because what he was building in the spring of 1968 was not just a protest. It was a coalition that had never existed before in American political life. Poor people of every background, united not by race, but by shared suffering and a shared demand. If that coalition held together, if it actually worked, if it actually changed something, the implications were enormous. Not just for one law or one policy, for the whole arrangement, for who had power and who did not and why. King knew this. He had thought it through. He was not naive about what he was asking for or who he was asking it from. He had been threatened before. His house had been bombed. He had been stabbed. He had received so many death threats that the people around him had stopped counting. He kept going anyway. There is a photograph of him from that spring. He is sitting at a table somewhere, papers in front of him, looking slightly off to the side. He looks tired in the way that only people carrying something very heavy look tired. Not sleepy. Tired in the bones. Tired in a place that sleep cannot reach. But he is still there, still at the table, still planning. The Poor People's Campaign was set for late spring. Washington was the destination. The tent city would rise. The people would come. He just had to get through April 1st. There were men who watched him, not from a distance, up close, close enough to hear him breathe. Some of them wore suits, some wore uniforms, some wore nothing that marked them at all. They sat in the pews of his church. They stood at the back of his rallies. They rented rooms in the hotels where he stayed and pressed their ears to the walls. They were paid to be there, paid by the government of the United States, paid to write down everything he said and did, and who he talked to, and what he ate for breakfast. We know this because they kept the files. Thousands and thousands of pages. Some of those pages have been released. Some have not. ones we have seen are enough to tell you something important. These men were not just watching. They were afraid of what they saw. One of those men was a young agent named Arthur Murtaugh. He worked for the FBI in Atlanta in the 1960s. He was assigned to monitor King. He sat in surveillance vans. He reviewed transcripts. He read reports that came in from other agents across the country. And years later, after he had retired and the weight of it had settled into him, he talked about what he had seen. He said the surveillance was total. He said the word they used inside the bureau was not investigation. The word was neutralization. He said that word stayed with him because an investigation is something you do when you want to find the truth. Neutralization is something you do when you have already decided what you want to happen. Murtaugh said the men around him did not talk about King the way you talk about a suspect. They talked about him the way you talk about an enemy. A real one, not a criminal. An enemy of the order of things. And that distinction, he said, was everything. There was another man, a congressional investigator named Geeton Fonzie. He spent years looking into political assassinations in America. He talked to people who had been inside rooms where decisions were made. He said the thing that struck him most was not the secrets. It was how ordinary the men who kept them seemed. They drank coffee. They had families. They went to church on Sundays. And they also signed off on things that would make your blood go cold. He said the files on King were not just surveillance. They were a portrait built over years with the patience of people who had all the time in the world and all the resources of the federal government behind them. Every phone call, every meeting, every private conversation, every moment of doubt or grief or anger that King ever let slip in a room he thought was safe. They had it, all of it, filed away in a building in Washington. A woman named Coretta Scott King talked about this in her own way. She said she always knew the phones were tapped. She said you get used to a kind of background hum in your life when you know someone is always listening. She said it changes how you speak, how you move, how you trust. She said Martin knew it too. He knew every room might have ears. He knew every friend might be reporting back to someone. And still he spoke. Still he planned. Still he trusted people. Because he said a man who trusts no one is already defeated. There was a minister in Memphis named James Lawson. He had known King for years. He was one of the men who invited King to come to Memphis for the garbage workers. He said in the weeks before April 4th, the surveillance was visible. You could feel it. Men standing where they had no reason to stand. Cars parked where no car needed to be. He said the people around King talked about it quietly. The way you talk about whether that is coming and cannot be stopped. Lawson said King was not unaware. He said King looked at all of it and made a choice. The choice was to keep going, to walk out onto that balcony, to stand in front of crowds, to be seen, because the alternative was to disappear, and disappearing was its own kind of death. The files are real. The men are real. The surveillance was real. And what they were watching was a man who was building something that had never been built before in this country. A coalition of the poor. A demand that could not be answered with a single law or a single speech. They watched him build it. They wrote it all down. And somewhere in those files is the shape of what they feared most. There is a name for what they were doing. It was not a secret exactly. It had a program name, a file number, a budget. It was called COINTELPRO. The letters stand for Counterintelligence Program. The FBI ran it. J. Edgar Hoover built it. And once you know what it was, a lot of things that seemed strange start to make a different kind of sense. COINTELPRO began in 1956. Its first target was the Communist Party in America, but it grew. It spread like roots under dry ground, quiet and invisible, until something pushed up through the surface. By the 1960s, it had turned its attention to civil rights groups, anti-war groups, black nationalist organizations, and anyone the FBI decided was a threat to what Hoover called the American way of life. The program did not just watch people. It worked to destroy them. Slowly, carefully, from the inside out. The methods were specific. Agents would send fake letters designed to start fights between organizations. They would leak false information to newspapers. They would contact employers and get people fired. They would tell a man's wife that he was having an affair, whether it was true or not. They would plant informants inside groups to steer decisions in the wrong direction. They would make a leader look like a criminal, or a fool, or a coward, until the people who followed him started to drift away. It was not violence most of the time. It was something quieter. It was the slow erosion of trust. King was in the files from early on. The FBI had been watching him since the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. By the time he gave his speech at the Washington Monument in 1963, there were agents in the crowd. By the time he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, Hoover had already written memos calling him the most dangerous Negro in America. That phrase appears in the actual documents. You can read it yourself. It is not a rumor. It is typed on FBI letterhead with a file number at the top. What the program did to King followed the same pattern it used on everyone else. But it was more intense, more personal. The surveillance was constant. His phones were tapped. His hotel rooms were bugged. Agents followed him city to city. They recorded his conversations, his meetings, his private moments. They built a file on him that eventually ran to hundreds of thousands of pages. Hundreds of thousands. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. The government of the United States spent years of effort and enormous resources documenting the life of a Baptist preacher from Atlanta who wanted poor people to be treated fairly, and the pattern kept repeating. Every time King moved in a direction that threatened something larger than local politics, the pressure increased. When he began speaking against the Vietnam War, the file got thicker. When he announced the Poor People's Campaign, the internal memos grew more urgent. When he arrived in Memphis in the spring of 1968, the surveillance around him was so visible that the people close to him could see it with their own eyes. That is the thing about a pattern. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The same names appear in different cities. The same tactics show up in different years. The same language appears in memos written by men who never signed their full names. And the timing always lines up with the moments when King was doing something that could not be answered with a single arrest or a single smear campaign. James Lawson, the man who invited King to Memphis, said the surveillance in those final weeks felt different, heavier, like the air before a storm settles into something still and waiting. The people around King felt it. King felt it, and still he kept his schedule. Still he spoke. Still he stood at podiums in front of crowds. COINTELPRO was officially ended in 1971. That is when a group of activists broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and stole a collection of files. When they released those files to the press, the program was exposed. Congress held hearings. Documents were released. The country learned, in plain language, what its own government had been doing to its own citizens for 15 years. But the hearings raised more questions than they answered. Because the files that were released were not all of the files. Some were held back. Some were destroyed. And the ones that remained told a story that stopped just short of its ending. The shape was there. The outline was clear. But the final pages were missing. And in the space where those pages should have been, the questions have lived ever since. Of all the things the FBI did to Martin Luther King Jr., one stands above the rest, not because it was the most secret, not because it was the most complex, but because it was the most personal, because it reached past the movement and past the speeches and past the crowds. It reached into the man himself, into his private life, into the quiet hours, and it tried to destroy him from the inside out. In November of 1964, someone at the FBI mailed a package to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's headquarters in Atlanta. The package contained an audio recording. The recording had been made from surveillance equipment placed inside hotel rooms where King had stayed. The FBI had been listening for years. They had gathered hours of private conversation, private moments, private life. And now they had decided to use what they had gathered. Inside the package, along with the recording, was a letter. The letter was unsigned. It was written to look like it came from a fellow Black American, someone who had once admired King and now felt betrayed by him. The language was bitter. The accusations were sharp. The letter told King that he was a fraud, that the world would soon know what kind of man he really was. That his private behavior made him unworthy of the trust people had placed in him. Then came the line that no one who has read it has ever forgotten. The letter told King he had 34 days. 34 days before the information would be made public. 34 days before everything he had built would come apart. And then, in language that was not quite direct, but was perfectly clear, the letter suggested that the only way to stop it was for King to take his own life. The FBI sent a suicide note to Martin Luther King Jr. The package was addressed to King, but it arrived first at the SCLC office. His wife, Coretta Scott King, opened it. She read the letter. She listened to the recording. And then she sat with what she had just received. She later said she was not surprised that the government had done something like this. She was surprised only by how naked it was, how plain, how little they had tried to hide what they were doing. King read the letter too. He gathered a small group of his closest advisors, and they sat together and talked through what it meant. The FBI had hoped the letter would isolate him. Instead, it pulled his circle tighter. He did not resign. He did not disappear. He did not break. But people who knew him in those years say something shifted. Not in his resolve, not in his public voice, but somewhere quieter, somewhere behind the eyes. The weight of knowing that the government of his own country had mailed him instructions to die was not a weight that simply lifted. It settled. It stayed. The letter was declassified decades later. William Sullivan, the head of the FBI's Domestic Intelligence Division, was eventually identified as the man who ordered it written. A researcher named David Garrow found the evidence and published it. The Senate's Church Committee, which investigated intelligence abuses in the 1970s, confirmed the broad outlines of what had happened. The FBI had targeted King not as a criminal, not as a spy, but as a symbol, as an idea, as something they believed needed to be erased. What makes this moment the heart of the mystery is not just the cruelty of it. It is the clarity. Most government wrongdoing hides behind procedure and paperwork and the slow gray fog of bureaucracy. This did not hide. This was direct. A package, a recording, a letter, deadline, a suggestion. It was the kind of act that tells you something about the people who ordered it, about how afraid they were, about how much they believed King could actually change things. Because you do not send a man a letter like that unless you believe he has real power. You do not try to break someone unless you believe they cannot be broken any other way. The letter did not work. King kept speaking. He kept organizing. He kept planning the poor people's campaign. He kept going to Memphis. He kept standing at podiums in front of crowds who needed to hear his voice. And so the question that has followed this story for more than 50 years is a quiet one, a simple one. If a letter was not enough to stop him, what came next? Who decided what came next? And how far up did that decision go? J. Edgar Hoover called Martin Luther King Jr. the most dangerous Negro in America. Not a threat, not a concern, not a problem to be managed. The most dangerous. Those were his words. He put them in writing. He said them out loud. He repeated them to senators and generals and presidents. He believed them the way some men believe in Scripture. Sit with that for a moment. The director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the most powerful law enforcement officer in the country, a man who had held that position for decades, a man who had files on presidents, a man who had survived every political storm since the 1920s. That man looked at a preacher from Atlanta and felt something close to terror. That is the impossible detail, not the surveillance, not the wiretaps, not even the letter. Those things are dark, but they have a kind of cold logic to them. Governments spy on people they fear. That is old and ugly and true. But Hoover's personal obsession with King went somewhere beyond policy. It went somewhere personal, somewhere that felt almost like hatred and almost like awe all at once. Hoover was not a man who scared easily. He had spent his career building a machine designed to crush dissent. He had files on senators. He had files on movie stars. He had files on civil rights leaders and labor organizers, and anyone who dared to suggest that America was not living up to its own promises. He used those files like a man uses a key. He opened doors with them. He closed doors with them. He kept people quiet. King would not stay quiet, and that seemed to genuinely unsettle him. The FBI began monitoring King in 1957. That is 11 years before Memphis. 11 years of listening to his phone calls, reading his mail, placing informants in his inner circle. 11 years of building a case that never quite became what Hoover wanted it to become. Because what Hoover wanted was proof that King was a communist, a puppet, a fraud. He wanted to find the string and show the American public who was pulling it. He never found the string because there was no string. What he found instead was a man, a complicated, human, deeply flawed man, the way all people are flawed. A man who got tired, a man who had doubts, a man who sometimes struggled under the weight of what the world had placed on his shoulders. The FBI recorded all of it. They cataloged his private moments with the same cold efficiency they used for everything else. And still, Hoover could not stop him. That is the part that bends the mind a little. The full power of the federal surveillance apparatus pointed at one man for over a decade, and it was not enough. The letter was not enough. The attempts to discredit him in the press were not enough. The whisper campaigns were not enough. King kept moving. The movement kept growing. The crowds kept coming. There is a memo in the FBI's own files, declassified, available to anyone who wants to read it. It was written in 1964, the same year King received the Nobel Peace Prize. In that memo, an FBI official wrote that the Bureau should find a way to, quote, neutralize King as an effective Negro leader. Not arrest him. Not charge him with a crime. Neutralize him. That word was chosen carefully. It is the kind of word that can mean many things. The memo went on to suggest that the Bureau should identify a suitable candidate to replace King. Someone more manageable. Someone the FBI could work with. Someone who would not organize poor people across racial lines. Someone who would not stand at a podium and name the war machine by name. Someone who would stay inside the boundaries that powerful men had decided were acceptable. They never found that person either, because the movement was not about one man. Hoover understood that on some level, and it seemed to make him angrier You can feel it in the language of the memos, the urgency, the frustration, the way the surveillance reports read less like intelligence documents and more like the notes of a man who cannot understand why the thing he is watching will not simply stop. The most dangerous Negro in America. That phrase has followed this story for 50 years. Not because it tells us something about King, but because it tells us something about Hoover, about what he feared, about what he saw when he looked at a preacher standing at a podium in front of a crowd of ordinary people who had decided they were done being afraid. He saw something he could not control. And for a man like Hoover, that was the most dangerous thing in the world. Now, let's talk about what the skeptics say. They have a point, several of them, actually. And if you want to understand this story fully, you have to sit with their arguments for a while. You have to let them breathe. The official version goes like this. James Earl Ray, a small-time criminal from Missouri, checked into a rooming house across the street from the Lorraine Motel on April 4th, 1968. He carried a rifle. He waited, and at 6:01 in the evening, Martin Luther King stepped out onto the second-floor balcony of room 306. One shot, and that was the end of it. Ray fled to Canada, then to England, then to Portugal. He was caught 2 months later at Heathrow Airport in London. He pleaded guilty. He went to prison. Case closed. The skeptics say that is a clean story. And clean stories about messy events should make you careful. But the other skeptics, the ones on the opposite side, say something different. They say, sometimes the clean story is just the true story. Sometimes a man with a rifle shoots another man. And all the searching for something bigger is just the human mind refusing to accept that history can turn on something so small and so ugly and so random. These skeptics are not foolish people. They point to the long history of conspiracy theories that have attached themselves to every major American tragedy. They point to the way grief can become suspicion, the way loss can become a need for a villain large enough to match the size of what was taken. They say that James Earl Ray had motive. He was a racist. He had a history of crime. He had the means and the opportunity, and he confessed. That last part is worth sitting with, he confessed. In a Memphis courtroom on March 10th, 1969, James Earl Ray stood before a judge and said he was guilty. He did not go to trial. He took the plea, and he was sentenced to 99 years in prison. The skeptics of the conspiracy say, "There it is. The man said he did it. What more do you need?" And then something strange happened. 3 days after he entered that guilty plea, James Earl Ray took it back. He said he had been pressured. He said his lawyer had told him a trial would end in the electric chair. He said he had not acted alone. He spent the rest of his life, until he died in prison in 1998, saying that a man he called Earl had set him up, that he had been used, that he had been a patsy. Now, the skeptics of the conspiracy have an answer for this too. They say Ray was a manipulative man who saw a chance to avoid execution and took it. They say the story about Earl was invented. They say no credible evidence of this mysterious figure was ever produced in a court of law. And here is where the skeptics on both sides run into the same wall. Room 306 at the Lorraine Motel sits on the second floor, facing south. The rooming house where Ray stayed sits across Mulberry Street, slightly to the north and west. The angle of the shot, the trajectory that the official investigation settled on, places the bullet coming from the bathroom window of that rooming house. But several witnesses on the ground that evening said the shot sounded like it came from a different direction. From the thick brush and trees below the rooming house, closer to the street, Memphis police had stationed officers in the fire station next to that brush earlier in the week. Those officers were pulled from their post the morning of April 4th. The skeptics of the conspiracy say witness memory is unreliable. They say sound bounces in strange ways between buildings. They say the officer reassignments were routine. And maybe they are right. But here is the thing that makes even careful, measured people go quiet for a moment. Here is the gap that does not close no matter how long you stare at it. The Lorraine Motel was not where King usually stayed in Memphis. He had stayed at a different hotel on previous visits. Someone called ahead and made a reservation at the Lorraine under his name. Someone put him in room 306 on an open balcony facing the street. Nobody has ever fully explained who made that call. The skeptics go quiet when you ask about that, not because they have no answer, but because the answers they have are not quite satisfying. And in this story, the unsatisfying answers are the ones that have kept people talking for more than 50 years. Some people do not need convincing. They were there. They saw what they saw. And no amount of official paperwork will ever change what their eyes and ears recorded on that warm April evening in Memphis. Solomon Jones was King's driver. He was standing near the parking lot of the Lorraine when the shot rang out. He told reporters clearly and without hesitation that he believed the shot came from the thick clump of bushes below the rooming house, not from above, not from the bathroom window where James Earl Ray supposedly crouched with his rifle. From below, from the brush, Jones was a calm man. He was not excitable. He said what he said, and he kept saying it for the rest of his life. Grace Stevens was inside the rooming house when the shot fired. She told investigators she saw a man running down the hallway right after the blast. She described him. The description did not match James Earl Ray. Her husband, Charles Stevens, gave a different account. He said he saw Ray. His testimony helped build the case against Ray. Grace Stevens was committed to a mental institution shortly after she gave her statement. She stayed there for years. When she got out, she still said the same thing. The man she saw was not James Earl Ray. You sit with that for a moment. A woman gives testimony that contradicts the official story. She gets locked away. She comes back out years later and has not changed her account by a single word. That kind of consistency is rare. People who are confused or mistaken tend to shift their stories over time. Grace Stevens never shifted. Earl Caldwell was a reporter for the New York Times. He was at the Lorraine that day, covering King's visit. He was standing near the pool when the shot came. He said the sound came from the bushes near the retaining wall below the rooming house, not from the building. He was a trained observer. It was his job to notice things and write them down accurately. He told his story. He kept telling it. He said the official version never matched what he heard with his own ears. There is something about people like this. They are not dramatic. They do not wave their arms. They speak in plain, steady voices, the way someone speaks when they have nothing to prove and nothing to gain. They already paid the price for saying what they said. Some of them lost credibility. Some of them lost work. Some of them spent years being dismissed as confused or emotional or unreliable. They kept talking anyway. That is a particular kind of courage. The quiet kind. The kind that does not ask for applause. The shot itself has been studied by acoustic experts, ballistic specialists, and independent investigators over the decades. Some of their findings line up with the official account. Some of them do not. The angle of entry of the bullet that struck King has been a point of quiet, persistent debate among people who understand how bullets travel and what they do when they hit a human body. The official story places the shooter in an elevated bathroom window. Some of the physical evidence suggests a lower angle. Not everyone agrees, but enough serious people have raised the question that it does not simply disappear. Then there are the firefighters, the men who worked at Fire Station 2, right next to that brushy lot. Several of them have said over the years that the reassignment of the black officers from their post that morning felt wrong to them. It felt deliberate. It felt like someone was clearing the area. These were not political men. These were working men who showed up to do a job and noticed something strange. They talked about it among themselves for years before some of them talked about it publicly. What all these people share is a kind of calm certainty. They are not angry exactly. They are settled. They made peace long ago with the fact that most people would not believe them. They told their stories anyway because the stories were true. And true things deserve to be spoken out loud even when no one is listening. The believers are not a single group with a single theory. They are scattered individuals who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time. They saw something. They heard something. And the official explanation, as carefully as it was constructed, never quite covered what they experienced. That gap between the official story and the human story is where this mystery lives. It is not a loud place. It is quiet and still, like a room just after someone has left it. Something was here. You can feel it, but you cannot quite name what it was. James Earl Ray was a small man with a small history. He had spent most of his life doing small crimes, gas station robberies, bad checks, a grocery store holdup that went sideways. He was not a planner. He was not a professional. He was not the kind of man who moved quietly through cities, rented rooms under false names, and slipped away across international borders without leaving a trail. And yet that is exactly what the official story asks you to believe he did. Memphis holds its memories close. The city sits along the Mississippi River like a man leaning on a fence post, watching the water move. The air there in April is soft and heavy. It smells of river mud and blooming things, and something older underneath. Something the soil has been keeping for a long time. If you stand on Mulberry Street today and look up at the Lorraine Motel, the building feels like it is still listening. The balcony is still there. The railing is still there. The light that falls on it in the late afternoon is golden and slow. The rooming house is still there too. Bessie Brewer's boarding house, just across the way, where Ray supposedly fired the shot. It sits at a slight angle to the motel. The bathroom window that Ray allegedly used looks out through a tangle of old brush and overgrown trees. The shot would have had to travel through that brush at a downward angle across an open lot and find its mark on a man standing on a second-floor balcony. People who know rifles and distances walked that ground for years. They measured it. They stood in that bathroom. They looked out that window. Some of them came away satisfied. Others came away with questions they could not shake. The brush was thick. The angle was awkward. The distance was not impossible, but it was not easy either. And James Earl Ray, by every account anyone ever gathered, was not a skilled marksman. He left the rifle behind. That is one of the strange things. He dropped it in the doorway of a nearby shop, wrapped in a blanket, along with a pair of binoculars and other items that could be traced directly back to him. A man careful enough to travel under false names and cross into Canada within hours of the shooting left his weapon on the sidewalk in plain sight. The ground near that doorway has been paved over many times since 1968, but people who were there that day remembered the way it looked. The bundle was neat, almost arranged, like something placed rather than dropped in a panic. The trees around the rooming house have grown differently over the decades. The old ones that stood along the brush line in 1968 are gone now, taken down in various renovations and clearings over the years. But photographs from that day show them clearly. Dense, layered, the kind of growth that takes decades to build. Some of the men who investigated the scene in later years noted that the brush had actually been cut back shortly before the shooting. Not long before, just enough to open a line of sight from a different angle entirely. From the ground, from the brush itself. The ground in that lot has never held a building. People have tried. Plans have been drawn up. Nothing has come of them. The land sits empty still, caught between the motel that became a museum and the rooming house that became a footnote. It is an odd little gap in the city, like a missing tooth. Locals walk past it without looking. Visitors sometimes stop and stare without knowing exactly why. Ray himself lived for 30 years after the shooting. He died in prison in 1998. In those 30 years, he told many versions of his story. He confessed. He recanted. He said he was set up by a man he knew only as Earl. He said Earl had directed his movements in the days before the shooting. He said he had not fired the shot. He said he did not know who did. He said a lot of things, and none of them fit together into a clean shape. That is the thing about James Earl Ray. He is not a satisfying villain. He is too small for the crime he was convicted of. Too ordinary. Too clumsy in all the ways that matter, and too precise in all the ways that are hard to explain. The land around Mulberry Street seems to understand this. It holds the contradiction without trying to resolve it. The river keeps moving. The light keeps falling on that balcony, and the story, like the ground beneath it, refuses to settle. James Earl Ray is not the only man in American history to confess to a killing and then spend the rest of his life saying he did not do it alone. That pattern shows up more than once. It shows up in ways that are hard to ignore once you start looking. Think about Jack Ruby. He walked into a Dallas police station in November of 1963 and shot Lee Harvey Oswald in front of a crowd of reporters and cameras. The whole country watched it happen. Ruby said he acted alone. He said he was grief-stricken over President Kennedy. He said it was personal. But in the years that followed, Ruby told people he was afraid. He said there were things he could not say in Dallas. He asked to be taken to Washington so he could speak freely. He said the people around him were not safe. He died in prison in 1967 before he ever got the chance to say whatever it was he was holding back. The full truth, if he had one, went with him. That is one version of the pattern. A man who pulls the trigger. A man who says there was more to it. A man who dies before the story comes out whole. There is another version too. The version where the man who is blamed keeps changing his story not because he is lying, but because the truth is too strange and too dangerous to say plainly. Ray fits that version. He gave investigators a name. Earl. He described a man who had recruited him, moved him around, given him money, and pointed him toward Memphis. Investigators looked for Earl for decades. The Justice Department looked. Private investigators hired by the King family looked. Some of them said they found a real person, a man who matched the description, a man with connections to shadowy work in the years when shadowy work was everywhere in this country. Whether that man was truly Earl, nobody has ever been able to prove in a court of law. But the name did not disappear. It kept coming back, the way certain names do in American mystery stories. This country has a long history of lone gunmen who were not quite as lone as the official story required. It has a history of convenient confessions and inconvenient retractions. It has a history of men who knew too much dying before they could speak, and men who knew just enough living long enough to muddy every clean answer. Ray lived. That is the strange part. He lived for 30 years, and he kept talking. He was not silenced the way Oswald was silenced. He was not killed in a jail corridor by a man with a gun and a grief story. He sat in a Tennessee prison and gave interviews and filed appeals, and told anyone who would listen that he had been used, that he had been a pawn, that somewhere above him decisions had been made by people whose names he either did not know or was too afraid to say out loud. There is a town in Louisiana called Faraday. It sits along the Mississippi River, not far from the water, in a part of the country where the air is thick and the history is thicker. In the 1960s, a man named Frank Morris ran a shoe shop there. He was a black business owner in a time and place where that made you a target. His shop was set on fire in 1964. He died from his burns. The FBI investigated and closed the case. Decades later, journalists and civil rights historians reopened it and found that the original investigation had been shaped by the very people who should have been suspects. The files had been managed. The story had been contained. That is the third version of the pattern. Not a lone gunman, not a patsy with a handler, just a quiet closing of a file. A decision made somewhere above the local level that certain deaths did not need full answers. These stories do not all connect to each other in a straight line. They are not a single conspiracy with a single author. They are something older and stranger than that. They are a habit, a way that power has sometimes moved in this country in the dark when it felt threatened. Ray said he did not do it alone. He said that from the beginning. He said it until he died. The question that stays open is not whether he was telling the truth. The question is what kind of truth he was telling, and who else was in the room when the plan was made, and whether those people ever had to answer for anything at all. Most of them did not. That part is not a mystery. That part is just history. There is a trial most people have never heard of. It happened in 1999 in a courtroom in Memphis, Tennessee. It lasted about 4 weeks. A jury heard the evidence, deliberated, and returned a verdict. And then, almost nothing. The news covered it briefly. A few paragraphs in the back pages of some papers. Then silence. The country moved on. But the trial happened. The record exists. You can hold it in your hands. Before we get to that verdict, we need to talk about the artifacts. The physical things, the objects and documents and photographs that survived the decades and still sit in archives and evidence boxes, waiting for someone to look closely enough. Start with the rifle. The Remington Model 760 Game Master. Serial number 461,476. It was found in the doorway of Canop's amusement company, a few doors down from the rooming house on South Main Street, wrapped in a green bedspread, sitting in a bundle like someone had dropped it in a hurry or left it there on purpose. A rifle left in plain sight on a busy street within minutes of a shooting. That detail has never stopped being strange. A man who planned this carefully enough to get close to one of the most watched figures in America, and then dropped his weapon on the sidewalk like a grocery bag. The bundle also contained a pair of binoculars, a beer can, a radio, a receipt from a hardware store. These were not the belongings of a man who expected to disappear quietly. They were the belongings of a man who left a trail. Some investigators over the years have said that trail was too clean, too complete, like a kit assembled to point in one direction. Then there are the photographs. Several exist from the hours just before and just after the shooting. In some of them, men appear in the background who have never been fully identified. This is not unusual at a public event, but some of these men were later connected loosely to military intelligence units that had no clear reason to be in Memphis that day. Their presence was noted in the files. Then the files were closed. The men were never asked to explain themselves in any formal proceeding. There is also the matter of the bushes. Behind the rooming house, there was a thick tangle of brush and scrub growth along a slope leading down toward the motel. Multiple witnesses said they heard the shot come from that direction, from low and to the side, not from the high bathroom window where the official story placed the shooter. In the days after the assassination, city workers came and cut that brush down, all of it. The physical evidence of what might have been a second position was gone before any independent investigator could examine it. The city said it was routine maintenance. It was not routine. Nothing about that week was routine. The Memphis Police Department had a special intelligence unit operating in the city during King's visit. Their files, when they were eventually examined years later, showed surveillance logs, photographs, and internal memos. Some of those documents had pages missing, not redacted, missing, removed. The gaps in the record are their own kind of artifact. An absence can tell you as much as a presence if you know how to read it. There is a photograph taken on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in the seconds after the shot. In it, several men are pointing. They are not all pointing in the same direction. Most point toward the rooming house, but one man, a man whose name appears in the witness logs, points toward the brushy slope. He was interviewed once. His statement was filed. It does not appear in the main body of the official investigation report. These are not rumors. These are not things whispered around a fire. They are documents, photographs, physical records. They exist in archives at the National Civil Rights Museum, in the files of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, in court records from later civil proceedings. They are available. They have been available for years. They are simply not discussed in the version of this story that most people learned in school. The trial in 1999 gathered many of these artifacts together in one place. It put witnesses on the stand. It entered physical evidence into the record. It asked the questions that the 1969 guilty plea had allowed everyone to skip, and a jury of 12 people in Memphis, Tennessee sat and listened to all of it. They listened for 4 weeks. Then they went into a room and they made a decision. That decision is the next part of the story. Before the jury came back with that decision, something else happened. Something quieter. Something that took years and cost a family more than most people know. The King family did not accept the official story. They never did. Not in 1968. Not in 1969 when James Earl Ray entered his guilty plea. Not in the decades that followed. They carried their doubt the way families carry grief. Quietly, steadily, never setting it down. Coretta Scott King was the one who kept pushing. She had buried her husband at 39 years old. She had raised 4 children in the shadow of that loss. She had watched the government close its files and move on, and when she had read enough, heard enough, spoken to enough people over the years to believe that the full story had never been told. She was not a bitter woman. People who knew her said she carried herself with a kind of still, warm dignity that filled a room. But she was not a woman who let things go when she believed something important was being hidden. Her children grew up with the questions. Dexter King, her son, became the one who pressed hardest in the later years. He was a young man when his father was killed. He grew into someone who wanted answers the way some people want air. In the 1990s, Dexter King did something that surprised a lot of people. He went to visit James Earl Ray in prison. He sat across from the man who had pleaded guilty to killing his father. He looked at him, and he asked him directly if he had done it. Ray said no. Dexter King said he believed him. That moment rippled out into the world. People did not know what to do with it. Some called it grief talking. Some called it the kind of strange mercy that only a son could offer. But Dexter King was not offering mercy. He was following a thread. He had come to believe, as his mother had come to believe, that Ray was a piece of a larger thing, a man used and then left to carry the weight of it alone. The family began working with a Memphis attorney named William Pepper. Pepper had known Martin Luther King in life. He had written about the assassination for years. He believed, after long investigation, that a conspiracy had taken King's life. He had names. He had witnesses. He had a theory about who gave the order and who pulled the strings. He also had a plan. If the criminal courts were closed, the civil courts were not. A civil lawsuit could put witnesses on the stand under oath. It could enter evidence into the record. It could force people to answer questions in front of a jury. It could not send anyone to prison, but it could establish, in the formal language of the law, what a jury of ordinary people believed to be true. The King family filed that lawsuit in 1999. They named a Memphis businessman named Lloyd Jowers as a defendant. Jowers had made statements over the years suggesting he had been involved in a plot to kill King. He had appeared on television. He had spoken to investigators. His story shifted some over time, but the core of it stayed strange and specific. trial was held in Memphis. It lasted 4 weeks. Witnesses came to the stand and said things that had never been said in open court before. Some spoke about the rooming house. Some spoke about the brushy slope. Some spoke about men who had given orders and men who had carried them out. The Department of Justice was not a party to the suit. The federal government did not send anyone to defend itself. The case was a civil matter between private parties, but the evidence that came in touched on things far larger than any one man. The courtroom was not packed with cameras. The national press gave it some attention, but not much. There was no live television coverage, no nightly updates on the major networks. For a trial that asked some of the biggest questions in American history, it passed through the news cycle quietly, like a stone dropped into still water. The family sat in that courtroom every day. They had waited 31 years for this. They had carried the weight of it through funerals and birthdays and graduations and all the ordinary days that pile up into a life. They had done the work. They had found the witnesses. They had built the case. And now 12 people in Memphis were going to decide what they thought had really happened on April 4th, 1968, on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. The jury went into that room. The door closed behind them. They were not gone long. That is the first thing you need to sit with. 12 people walked into a room with all of that evidence, all of those witnesses, all of those decades of questions piled on top of questions. And they came back in less than 3 hours. They had made up their minds. The verdict came on December 8th, 1999. 31 years, 8 months, and 4 days after Martin Luther King Jr. fell on that balcony in Memphis. The jury found in favor of the King family. They found that Lloyd Jowers, the man who had owned Jim's Grill below the rooming house, had been part of a conspiracy to kill Dr. King, and they went further. They found that unnamed others had been part of that conspiracy too. Government agencies were named in the verdict, not by name exactly, but the language was clear enough. The jury believed that Martin Luther King Jr. had not been killed by one man acting alone. The damages were set at $100. That number is worth pausing on. $100. The family had not come for money. They had said that from the beginning. They came for the record. They came so that 12 people in a Memphis courtroom could look at the evidence and say what they believed. The money was almost beside the point. It was a symbol, a marker, a way of saying that something real had been decided here. Coretta Scott King stood outside that courthouse in the winter air. She was 62 years old. She had been a widow for more than 3 decades. She had raised 4 children without their father. She had carried his name and his work forward through years that were not always kind to either. And she said that she felt a sense of peace, not triumph, not anger, peace, like something that had been held open for a long time had finally been allowed to close. The press covered it, some of it. The story ran in newspapers and on the evening news, but it did not shake the country the way you might expect. There were no hearings called in Congress, no special prosecutors appointed, no grand investigations launched by the Department of Justice. The verdict sat there in the public record, and the country mostly moved on. The news cycle is a river. It does not stop for anything. Some people said the trial was not credible. They pointed out that it was a civil case with no opposing counsel. The Department of Justice had declined to participate. There was no cross-examination from the government. No one stood up to challenge the witnesses on behalf of the agencies named in the testimony. Critics said the whole thing was one-sided by design, that you cannot trust a verdict when only one side shows up to argue. Those are fair points. They deserve to be said out loud. But here is the other side of that. The government was invited. The Department of Justice knew the trial was happening. They chose not to send anyone. If the evidence was as thin as critics said, the easiest thing in the world would have been to walk into that courtroom and say so. They did not. Whether that silence means guilt or indifference or something else entirely, only the people who made that decision know for certain. What you are left with is this: a jury of 12 people in Memphis heard weeks of testimony. They heard from witnesses who had never spoken publicly before. They looked at documents and photographs and physical evidence. They deliberated. came back with a decision that said one man did not do this alone. That decision lives in the legal record of Shelby County, Tennessee. It is not a rumor. It is not a theory passed around on the internet. It is a verdict rendered in a court of law by 12 ordinary people who took an oath to tell the truth about what they believed. The King family left Memphis that December with something they had not had before. Not justice, exactly. The word justice feels too large and too clean for what actually happened. But something, a piece of paper that said their grief had been heard, that the questions they had carried for 31 years were not crazy, that the story they had always believed deserved to be taken seriously. The cold air outside that courthouse was sharp and clear. The sky over Memphis was pale and wide. The city went on around them the way cities do. Traffic moved. People walked. The river ran south the way it always had. The family drove away. The verdict stayed behind. And the questions, as questions always do, kept going. Now go back with me. Go back to that night. It is April 4th, 1968. The sun has dropped below the western edge of Memphis. The sky has gone from orange to purple to a deep, soft black. The air is cool for April. Not cold enough to bite, but cool enough that you pull your collar up a little. Cool enough that you notice it on your cheeks and on the backs of your hands. You are standing on Mulberry Street. The street is narrow and quiet. Old brick buildings line both sides. Their walls are the color of dried clay, dark red and dusty, worn smooth by decades of sun and rain. A few windows glow with yellow light. The rest are dark. The pavement beneath your feet is uneven, cracked in places. The kind of street that has been here a long time and has seen a great deal. To your right, the Lorraine Motel sits low and wide. It is a modest place, 2 stories, an L-shaped building painted in cream and turquoise, those colors bright and cheerful even in the dark. A neon sign glows above the entrance, soft and buzzing, casting a little pool of pink light onto the parking lot below. Cars sit in the lot, still and quiet. The swimming pool out front is dark and still, the water black as ink under the night sky. Somewhere above you, On the second floor, room 306 looks out over the railing. The railing is painted white. It catches what little light there is. Now turn around. Across the street and slightly north, there is a row of old buildings, flop houses and small businesses, the kind that have always existed in every American city, the kind that nobody notices. One of them is Bessie Brewer's rooming house. It is a tired building, peeling paint the color of old mustard. Narrow windows. A fire escape on the side that looks like it has not been used in years. Inside, the hallways smell like cigarette smoke and old wood, and the particular kind of quiet that settles into places where people are just passing through. Behind those buildings, there is a brushy lot, overgrown, tangled with weeds and scrub trees, and the kind of thick undergrowth that grows wherever city land goes untended. In the dark, the brush is a mass of deep shadow. You cannot see into it. The shapes of the branches are soft and blurred against the sky. A few dry leaves move in the small wind that comes off the river. The river is close. You can feel it more than hear it. The Mississippi runs just a few blocks west of here. It is wide and slow and dark tonight, the color of old iron, moving south the way it has moved south for 10,000 years. The smell of it drifts through the streets, damp and muddy and alive. The smell of something very large and very old, moving without hurry. The city around you is not silent. It never is. Somewhere a few blocks away, a car engine turns over and fades. A dog barks once and stops. A radio plays something low and indistinct from an open window, just a thread of melody, too faint to name. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary Thursday evening in a mid-sized American city in the spring. And yet, there is a weight to this place tonight. You feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. Something in the air that is heavier than air. The kind of stillness that comes just before something shifts. Up on that second floor balcony, a man is standing. You cannot see his face from here. You can see the shape of him, the broad shoulders, the way he stands with a kind of ease, the way a man stands when he is comfortable in his own body. He has been inside all day. He came out to breathe the evening air, to feel the cool of it, to look up at the sky, which is wide and full of stars now, the kind of sky that makes you feel both small and held at the same time. The stars over Memphis are cold and bright and very far away. The street below is quiet. The brush behind the rooming house is dark and still. The river moves south. You are standing on Mulberry Street in the spring of 1968, and the whole world is balanced on the edge of a single second. The air smells like the river and the old brick, and something green coming up through the cracks in the pavement. New growth. April always brings it. You are here. You are present. You are small under the stars, and the night holds everything it knows. Some names keep coming back, no matter how many years pass, no matter how many reports get filed and shelved and forgot. The names come back like water finding its level, like something that cannot stay buried. You have heard some of them already in this story. Hoover, Ray, the FBI, military intelligence, local police, men in suits who kept files on a preacher because they were afraid of what he was building. But there are other names, quieter ones, names that showed up in testimony and then disappeared, names that appeared in documents released decades later, half blacked out with thick marker, as if someone had tried to erase them and only made you more curious. Lloyd Jowers was one of those names. He was the man who ran Jim's Grill, the restaurant below Bessie Brewer's rooming house on South Main Street. He was the man who, in 1993, went on national television and said he had been paid to help arrange the killing. He named a man he called Earl. He said the real shooter was not James Earl Ray. He said the shot came from the brush behind his building. He said he had been living with this for 25 years, and he could not carry it anymore. The government said he was lying, or confused, or chasing money. They said there was no credible evidence. They said the case was closed. But the King family sat across from Lloyd Jowers in a Memphis courtroom in 1999, and they believed him. And a jury of 12 ordinary people believed him too. That jury found that Jowers and unnamed others, including agencies of the government, had conspired to kill Martin Luther King Jr. It was a civil verdict. It carried no criminal weight. It put no but it existed. It was real. 12 people heard the evidence and came back with an answer. And that answer was not James Earl Ray acting alone. The name Real kept coming up too. Ray himself used it for decades. He said a man named Real had guided him, moved him, handed him a rifle, and then vanished. The government said Real did not exist, but investigators working for the King family found a man in the 1990s who matched the description. A man with ties to gun running and intelligence work. A man whose photograph James Earl Ray identified. That man denied everything. His name was never charged. His name was never fully cleared either. There were other names. Frank Liberto was a Memphis produce merchant with alleged ties to organized crime. His name came up in testimony from a man named John McFerrin, who said he overheard a phone call at Liberto's store just before the assassination. He said he heard a voice say the job would be done and the payment would be made. Liberto denied it. He died in 1975. His name kept coming up anyway. The name of the 902nd Military Intelligence Group came up. They had a surveillance team in Memphis the day King was killed. The Army admitted this years later. They said it was routine. They said they were monitoring civil unrest. They said they had nothing to do with the shooting, but they were there on that day, in that city, watching. And then there is the name that sits at the center of everything, the name that connects the files and the letters and the wiretaps and the surveillance and the slow campaign to destroy a man's reputation and his will. Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, the man who called King the most dangerous man in America, the man who sent that letter, the man who spent years trying to break him and could not. Hoover died in 1972. He never answered for any of it. His files were sealed. Some were destroyed. Some were released in pieces decades later, with whole pages blacked out. What remains is enough to show the shape of what was done. What was taken is enough to make you wonder what the shape looked like whole. These names do not form a clean picture. They form something more like a fog. You can see shapes moving inside it. You can make out outlines, but the fog does not lift all the way. It never has. maybe that is the point. Maybe the fog was always part of the plan. What you are left with is this. A man stood on a balcony in Memphis in the spring of 1968. He was shot. He died. And the people who may have wanted him dead were never brought to account. Their names floated through the years like smoke, present, ungraspable, real. There is a woman named Evelyn. She grew up in Memphis. She was 9 years old in April of 1968. She remembers the day clearly, the way children remember things that crack the world open. Her mother pulled her inside from the yard. The radio came on. The house went quiet in a way that felt like a held breath. Evelyn's family moved north 2 years later. Chicago, then Detroit, then a small town in Michigan where the winters came early and stayed long. She carried Memphis with her the way you carry a scar, not always visible, but always there under the surface, tender when pressed. She grew up and became a librarian. She spent her whole life around paper and words. And somewhere along the way, she started collecting documents, not originals, copies, printouts, pages from the National Archives, pages from the FBI's public reading room, pages that had been released under the Freedom of Information Act, a little at a time, over many decades, like water dripping through stone. The government began releasing files on Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1970s, then more in the 1980s, then more in the 1990s. Each release came with conditions. Each release came with redactions. Black bars over names. Black bars over dates. Black bars over whole paragraphs that might have told you something important. The pages looked like they had been through a war. Some of them had. Evelyn kept a binder, then 2 binders, then a whole shelf. She was not a conspiracy theorist. She was a librarian. She believed in primary sources. She believed in what the documents actually said, not what people wanted them to say. And what they said was enough to keep her reading for 30 years. The files showed surveillance, constant, grinding surveillance, phone taps, hotel room recordings, informants inside King's own circle. The scale of it was hard to take in. The government of the United States spent years treating one of its own citizens like an enemy of the state. Not a foreign spy, not a criminal. A preacher from Atlanta who wanted poor people to be treated like human beings. Some of what Evelyn found in those pages was already known. The anonymous letter, the recordings, Hoover's memos, but some of it was quieter, smaller. A note here about a meeting, a name there that appeared once and never again. Threads that led somewhere and then simply stopped, cut off by a black bar or a missing page or a file that the archives listed as destroyed. The JFK Records Act of 1992 opened new doors. It was meant for the Kennedy assassination, but it pulled other things into the light too. Documents related to intelligence operations in the 1960s. Documents that touched the edges of what happened in Memphis. Researchers combed through them. Journalists combed through them. People like Evelyn combed through them in their spare time in small Michigan towns under the yellow light of a desk lamp. And still, certain files stayed closed. The government said some records needed more time. National security, ongoing sensitivities. The phrases were vague and the deadlines kept moving. Documents that were supposed to be released by one date got pushed to another date, then another. The pattern was familiar to anyone paying attention. Release a little, hold back more, let the years do the rest. Evelyn retired in 2011. She kept her binders. She passed some of her research to a professor at a university in Ohio who was writing a book. She gave copies to a young journalist in Detroit who had started asking the same questions she had been asking for decades. The story moved through hands. It traveled. It adapted to new places and new voices, but it never changed its core shape. That shape is this. A government surveilled a man. That same government may have known about a threat to his life. That same government has never fully explained what it knew or when it knew it. The files that might answer those questions are either gone or still locked away behind black bars and closed doors. Evelyn kept one page framed on her wall. It was almost entirely redacted. You could see the header. You could see the date. You could see a few words at the bottom that had survived the black bars. The words said simply that the subject remained a priority concern. The subject was Martin Luther King Jr. The date was 3 weeks before he died. She looked at that page for years. She never stopped wondering what the blacked-out lines said. She suspected she already knew the shape of it. She just could not prove it. And that, she would tell you, is exactly how they wanted it. That is how they wanted it. And yet here you are, still listening, still turning the story over in your hands like a smooth stone pulled from a cold river. That means something. It means the story is not finished. It means the door is still open, and the light coming through it is just enough to see by, but not enough to see everything. Stories die when people stop asking about them. This one has not died. It has been more than 50 years since that evening on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. More than 50 years since the shot rang out over Memphis, and the whole country went quiet with grief. And still, every year, new people find their way to this story. Young people who were not alive in 1968. People who grew up in countries far from Tennessee. People who stumbled across a document or a book or a conversation and felt something shift inside them. That feeling is not paranoia. It is not obsession. It is the natural response of a thinking person to a story that does not add up. The reason this story stays alive is simple. The answers have never come. Not fully. Not cleanly. The official version has holes in it that have never been patched. James Earl Ray confessed and then recanted. He spent the rest of his life saying he did not act alone. A civil jury in 1999 agreed that a conspiracy existed. The United States government was named in that verdict. The government did not appeal. It did not hold a press conference. It did not explain itself. It moved on, and the story kept moving too, carried by the people who could not let it go. There is something about an unanswered question that lives in the body. You feel it low in your chest. It is not quite pain. It is not quite hunger. It is the feeling of a word you cannot remember, a name just out of reach, a door you passed once that you always meant to go back and open. This story gives millions of people that feeling, and they return to it the way you return to a place that meant something to you once, hoping something will have changed, hoping the light will fall differently this time, the files are the center of it. Always the files. The government holds documents about Martin Luther King Jr. that have not been released. Some were destroyed. Some were lost, or so the story goes. Some sit in archives behind classification levels that have not been lifted. Every few years, a new batch gets released. Researchers go through them line by line, and every time there are new redactions, new black bars, new silences where words should be. The pattern does not suggest innocence. It suggests protection. But protection of what, exactly, is still the question. The King family has said for decades that they believe the government was involved, not as a fringe theory, not as grief talking, as a considered position held after years of research and a legal proceeding that produced a verdict. Coretta Scott King said it plainly before she died. Her children have said it plainly since. They are not asking for sympathy. They are asking for the truth, and the truth has not come. What keeps a mystery alive is not the absence of facts. It is the presence of facts that point somewhere and then stop. A thread you can follow for a long time before it disappears into a wall. This story has many such threads. The rooming house and the brush, the missing evidence, the changed security detail, the surveillance that ran right up to the end. Each thread leads somewhere real, and then each thread goes dark. Maybe that is the point. Maybe the darkness is the answer in its own way, not the darkness of nothing being there, but the darkness of something being hidden. There is a difference. One feels like an empty room. The other feels like a room with the lights off and someone standing very still inside it. You can sit with that. You do not have to solve it tonight. The story will be here tomorrow. It will be here in 10 years. It will be here when people who have not yet been born grow old enough to start asking questions, because the questions are that good, because the man at the center of them was that important, because what happened in Memphis in April of 1968 still matters in ways that reach all the way into the present, into the air you breathe, into the country you live in. The door is open. The light is thin, but it is there. And somewhere behind it, the truth is still waiting to be found. we are. The fire is low. The last of the wood has gone to coals, orange and slow, breathing like something alive. The night is deep around you. The kind of deep that feels like the whole world has gone quiet and left just you and the dark and the soft sound of your own breathing. You have carried this story a long way tonight. You started in Memphis, in the spring, when the air smelled like honeysuckle and diesel, and something about to change. You walked through the streets where the garbage men marched with signs that said, "I am a man." You stood in the crowd at Mason Temple when the thunder rolled outside, and a preacher spoke like he already knew something the rest of the room did not. You followed the threads, the files, the letters, the surveillance vans parked on quiet streets, the men in suits who wrote his name in margins and circled it twice. You sat with the questions that have no clean answers. And now the story is told, or as told as it can be. Because this kind of story does not end. It does not close like a door. It stays open, just a crack, with that thin line of light still showing underneath. The questions breathe. The threads keep running. Somewhere in a building in Washington, in a box that has not been opened in years, there may be a piece of paper that would make everything clear. Or maybe not. Maybe the full truth is something we will never hold in our hands all at once. But here is what we do know. A man lived. He was born in Atlanta on a cold January morning in 1929. He grew up in a house full of faith and music, and the particular kind of courage that comes from knowing the world is not fair and choosing to love it anyway. He became a preacher. He became a voice. He became something that frightened people who had never even met him, because what he was saying was too big, too real, too dangerous to the way things were arranged. He talked about race. Then he talked about poverty. Then he talked about war. And with each new thing he named, the circle of people who wanted him quiet grew wider and more powerful. He knew it. He said so out loud. He kept talking anyway. That is the part that stays with you. Not the mystery of who gave the order. Not the question of which window the shot came from. Not the name of the man who may or may not have acted alone. Those questions matter. They deserve answers. But underneath all of it is something simpler and more lasting. A man's stood on a balcony in Memphis on an April evening, and the sky was turning that particular shade of blue that comes just before dark, and he was laughing. He was talking to a friend in the parking lot below. He was a human being, warm and present, full of plans for the next day and the day after that. And then the world changed. But here is the thing about dreams. The men who feared him feared the dream more than the man. They thought if they could stop him, they could stop the idea. That is not how ideas work. That is not how love works. That is not how a voice works when it has already been heard by millions of people who carried it home in their chests like a coal from a fire. The dream did not die in Memphis. It scattered. It went into the air and the water and the ground. It went into the mouths of people who had never stood in the same room with him. It went into the future, into years he never got to see, into arguments and marches and laws and children who learned his words before they learned to read. The men who feared him are gone now. Most of them have been gone for decades. Their files are yellowing in boxes. Their names are footnotes. His name is on schools and streets and bridges in every state in this country. His voice is still playing somewhere right now, in a classroom or a car or a phone held up at a rally on a cold morning. The dream outlasted the men who feared it. It always does. The Lorraine Motel still stands in Memphis. They made it a museum. People come from everywhere to stand on that balcony and look out at the parking lot and the sky. The air there is quiet. The light falls soft and gold in the late afternoon. It feels like a place that remembers. Subscribe for a brand new mystery every night. One tap and a new story is waiting for you tomorrow. Sleep well.